Welcome, everyone. Hi, my name is Joel Hellman. I'm Dean of the School of Foreign Service here at Georgetown University. It's wonderful to be able to welcome you here in person for those who are joining us in our room. It's wonderful to be able to have a strong audience on Zoom for this event. It's a symposium called Soviet Collapse, History, Geopolitics, Society, Culture, and Memory. So I hope you'll allow me to get a little personal in this event, because first of all, I know the speakers and the subject reasonably well. I want to tell you a little bit about my kind of personal story, because it says something about a little bit of the art of what we're talking about. I got my undergraduate degree in Soviet area studies in 1984. And then I got a master's degree in Russian and Eastern European studies in 1988. And I got a Ph.D. in political science, focusing on the political economy of the former Soviet Union in 1991. So this arc, this generational arc, starts for me and for several of our speakers, and all of our speakers would have reached the arc in some way. Right? Starting my interest in in the height of Cold War understanding of the Soviet Union and what it meant for the global order, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and the collapse of the Soviet Union. So starting out, sort of studying what had been a bipolar world and a Soviet empire, and ending up not very many years later studying multiple case studies, 15 countries coming out of the Soviet Union, of Eastern Europe and Eastern Europe, moving in different directions, creating a field that once was about international affairs and bipolarity to comparative politics, because we had so many countries developing in potentially different directions. But also, of course, a tremendous sense of possibility, tremendous sense of optimism. The absurd now, or what it seems now to be argument of the end of history, that essentially liberal democracy had won in the great bipolar world of division between the Soviet Empire and the West. And it was a remarkably exciting time, not only for the study of world politics, economics, societies, cultures, and how they would develop. It was also an exciting time about re-envisioning what academia could be, and what the engagement with a world in the midst of tremendous change, perhaps the most important change in our lifetimes, those of us to our adulthood in this period. So it's remarkable now, 30 years later, to be in a situation in which, as we know from today's papers, we have about 75, 80,000 troops, perhaps 175,000 massing on the border of Ukraine. I just came from an event in which we were honoring with the Hillary Rodham Clinton Awards, remarkable women across the world. One of them, a woman in Russia who is leading work on domestic violence, who's been branded a foreign agent, and was discussing tales of being tailed, of being followed, of being restricted and constrained in ways that were very familiar for us in the Soviet days. A kind of political world in which we seem to be almost slipping back into a Cold War rhetoric, whether it's with China, whether it's Russia, but the notion of we're on the cusp of a democracies summit, which presumably is opposed to a non-democracies group of nations. So it just is remarkable that after 30 years, we are back in engagement that I think none of us, I don't think anyone could have anticipated. I think one that is deeply troubling to so many of us, deeply disappointing, but one that we really need to understand fully and understand where this world is going. So it's in that spirit that it's remarkable that we can bring together such a wonderful productive and engaging group of scholars from different perspectives to be talking about what the impact of that collapse, of the Soviet collapse 30 years ago was, what it meant at the time, what it means for us now. And I think that's the subject of this engagement. Now, one of the exciting things about this is that this a remarkable collapse had so many different dimensions. I think the choice of series say, let's not just look at the politics of the international aspects of it, but it had dimensions across multiple disciplines. Exactly right, because it was such a category in so many ways. So I'm very pleased that this is brought together a multidisciplinary group to look at this and have a real discussion about this, what the cultural factors, the political factors. We had talked a little bit, there's just not enough time even to just deal with the economic factors. I think are kind of critical and important to this, but the historical factors, sociological factors, and others. And that's what we do today. So let me introduce the scholars that have been brought together for this event. We've got Catherine Stoner. Great to see you here, Catherine. She is currently the Mosbacher Director of the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, CDRL, and a senior fellow at the Freedom Spoken Institute of International Studies at Stanford University. She's a political science professor by courtesy at Stanford and a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. In her most recent book, Russia Resurrected Its Power and Purpose in a New Global Order, obviously deals with critical issues. Just recently out of Oxford University Press. We've got Stephen Kotkin here. He is the John Birkeland 52 Professor in the Department of History at Princeton, with a joint appointment at Princeton's School of Public and International Affairs. Vice Dean there. His books have shaped the field of Soviet history in so many ways, including Magnetic Mountain, Stalinism as a Civilization, and Armageddon, Averted the Soviet Collapse, looking from 1970 to 2000. And of course, his most recent book is the second of a projected 3-volume monumental study of the life of Joseph Stalin. And we've got Kelly Smith. She is here, of course, well known to us here at Georgetown. She's a professor here in the series, the author of 2 books on memory and politics in post-Soviet Russia, Remembering Stalin's Victims, Popular Memory at the End of the USSR, and Myth-Making in the New Russia, Politics and Memory of Yeltsin. Her most recent book is Moscow 1956, Silent Spring, and she's involved in a new project now on Yeltsin, the writers created by Stalin. I don't know if we have the other 2. Are they online? Oh, great, wonderful. I didn't see the little. I can only see that thing, so I don't see the little picture. It's great. It's wonderful to see Olga Shevchenko here. She's professor of sociology and Department of Anthropology and Sociology at Williams College, where I got that Soviet Area Studies degree at Williams College. Before she teaches courses there on social theory, post-socialism, sociology, consumer culture, photography, and memory. She's the author of Crisis and Everyday, Crisis and the Everyday in Post-Socialist Moscow, and the editor of A Double Exposure of Memory and Photography. We just recently lost, I have to say this for those of you in this community, we recently lost one of the great Williams College professors of history, Russian history, William Wagner, who we just suddenly lost only a few weeks ago, which we terribly sort of sad to hear about. And finally, we have Elliot Borenstein here, who is on the screen, who's professor of Russian and Slavic studies and senior academic convener for the Global Network at NYU. He is author most recently of Pussy Riot, Speaking Punk to Power, and Plots Against Russia, Conspiracy and Fantasy After Socialism. And he's now writing a book called Unstuck in Time on the Post-Soviet Uncanny. Great title. And moderating the event, of course, is our own Michael A. Fox, the director of series here and a professor of history at Georgetown and the editor of So let me turn it over to Michael, and let me enthusiastically welcome our guest. Really important and fascinating discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel, for that introduction. You know, thinking about your remarks, I think in some ways all of us here, as scholars, are part of we call the class of 1991 in one way or another. I'm going to moderate, but I'm also going to immediately abuse my position as moderator to requisition some time, give my own remarks as a Russian Soviet historian, and to speak a little bit about 1991 as a great turning point in history. Then I'll turn briefly to the goals of the symposium. People knew 30 years ago, you know, the end of the Soviet Union as a state was a very big deal. But arguably, even 10 years ago, it was far less clear how it could compare or could be understood in light of other great turning points in Russian Soviet history. And I began thinking about how political and cultural historians have analyzed those major turning points between regimes, between eras, between Peter the Great starting in 1701, which marked the shift from Muscovy to Imperial Russia, the Great Reforms beginning in 1855, which marked the turn from pre-reform Imperial Russia to late Imperial Russia, and of course the first of the two great state breakdowns in the 20th century, the Russian Revolution of 1917. So the question I began thinking about is how do we address continuities across these radical shifts? How can we understand that why the more things change, the more they seem to remain the same? An entire book could be written about this. Actually, I think it should be. And after Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, when what I call vulgar continuity theories came to the fore in this country, about eternal Russia, I began teaching an entire course about the most sophisticated kind of critical analysis of the most sophisticated continuity theories that are out there, starting with Edward Kennan and Alfred J. Weber, and so on. I can only touch on a few points, but first, mentalities, underlying tenets of political culture, deep-seated cultural social orientations, they can shift far more slowly than ideological change or even significant economic reorientation. Those kinds of deep structures are really hard to get at to prove historically. In fact, there are many concrete mechanisms by which continuities are perpetuated across great breaks. First and the most obvious is people, ordinary as well as elite actors, whose lives span old and new regimes and who change but cannot or do not completely reinvent themselves. The early Soviet state was mostly staffed by non-communists, Tsarist era holdovers, the so-called bourgeois specialists. After 1991, the only partial kind of circulation of elites was not about the triumph only, as well known, it's not only about this, about the triumph of these Komsomol entrepreneurs or mid-level cadres. We can see now, I think, much more clearly how the consolidation of a post-Soviet elite, at least in the Russian Federation, was a partial generation shift. A recent study suggests that 70% of the current Russian elites have relatives with ties to the old nomenclatura. This goes beyond what the Soviets used to do down as semiyism, as family ties. The point is that 1991 was not a full-fledged revolution, here very much unlike 1917. The Lubyanka, in fact, came close to being sacked. Unlike the Bastille or the Ochranka building in February 1917, it never was, and precisely because of the efforts of the Yeltsin team, which at that point wanted to play the Russian card in order to take over Soviet institutions and become the successor state of the USSR. But more than that, in periods of major change and attempted reform, such as the 1990s, significant oppositional groupings bide their time, waiting for their chance to shift the order yet again. Because the enlightened bureaucrats of the Great Reform saw their best recourse in the power of autocracy rather than building support from below, the era of counter-reforms became part of a deep-seated cyclical pattern. And in fact, if you look at the entire second half of the Soviet period, that also shaped, was shaped by the battle between the friends and the foes of reform. More generally, the entire late Soviet elite, as Andreas Vatsiosi pointed out, after Soviet victory in World War II in 1945, never had to go through the kinds of wrenching changes that occurred among European elites, either because of defeat or decolonization. In the mid-2000s, we can now see, I think, more clearly, Putinism crystallized as a kind of preventative counter-revolution, used Koval's phrase, against color revolutions in the near abroad or potential color revolutions at home. I'll make two final points. First, the processes, and happen very quickly, and they fall, in 1991 happened at a very fast pace, but the processes of that year in which new regimes crystallized, and here I'm thinking not only post-91, but post-1917, and comparing that, they set up long-term problems and conflicts for decades. The Union Treaty of 1922, which created the structure of the Soviet Union and the Union Republics, hardly caused 1991, but it certainly informed the long-term process, right, which interacted with those short-term triggers of the Soviet collapse. What Martin Mailia called an ideological time bomb built into the ever, receding promises of a radiant Soviet future. And what I once called, with apologies to Paul Kennedy, his notion of an imperial overstretch, called ideological overstretch, which is the Stalin era notion that everything Soviet is superior. Those represented long-term structural roots of what later interacted with the rapid flux leading up to the final endgame. So if history doesn't repeat but rhymes, there will be a new turn of the wheel after Putin, just as there was after the long reign of Stalin. And in this light, I'm struck reading Vladislav Zubov's new book, Collapse, which we discussed just last week, how much the seeds of future conflicts surrounding the Russian presidency, Ukraine and Crimea, NATO, were embedded in the decisions, the missteps, the power plays, and just kicking the can down the road that occurred as events unfolded in 1991, almost 30 years to the day now, if you think that the Ukrainian referendum on independence was December 2nd, the Minsk agreement creating the Commonwealth of Independent States was December 8th. So in this respect, 1991, may well not yet be over, as Angela Stead pointed out in our discussion today. But my last point has not to do with Russian or Soviet history, but global history. I'm talking here about the loss of empire. The changes of 1991 were truly unprecedented in comparison with those other great turning points talked about in history when you think about the territorial changes. The Soviet Union had avoided the fate of the Ottomans, of the Habsburgs, by sort of putting Humpty Dumpty back together again with the glue of communism and the paradoxical phenomenon of an anti-imperialist empire, or at least a multinational state that became more imperial over time. But the wrenching changes and long-lasting revanchism of imperial successor states are only too well known, and they have nothing to do with the Russian soul. So now to shift gears to the purpose and the promise of this symposium, historians have only just begun to bring their own toolkit to the table, to the study of 1991. And if I think about German history, for example, it seems like almost every great German historian or scholar in the German field has attempted to explain continuities that underlying or subtle ones across the great changes of 1918, 1933, 1945, and the two Germanys, 1989. It's high time that Russian historians did the same and bring our perspectives to this interdisciplinary conversation. But a great turning point can only be understood from many angles. In the Russian field, was the paradigm for area studies in this country. And I myself was a product of Russian area studies. And it was predicated on the notion that there are multiple roads to knowledge surrounding complex regions of the world. And, regional studies are built into the DNA here at the SFS at Georgetown, and that series and other regional centers form part of its structure. But in recent decades, the disciplines in our field are often speaking to their own specialized audiences far more than to one another. And this is true of historians and political scientists, but it's also true more broadly of humanities and social science. So when I became director of series this year, I decided to make an attempt to restart new dialogues, and this symposium is the first major gesture in this direction. And you might think of it, therefore, as a kind of experiment. None of us have coordinated what we're going to say. None of us know what it's going to add up to. So after the presentations, the panelists will have time to interact and react to one another's what each one has said. So let's see what happens. Thank you.
Now I unmask, and you can see it as me. It would be very easy to impersonate. Okay, so since I'm a political scientist, I have to have slides. And I come from California, and we always have to have slides. We come out of Silicon Valley. So I'm going to just hit a few highlights of where we've been with Russia, where we are right now, and where we might be going. I should say, since you both started off with a little bit of biographies, this is actually, it has been the arc of our lives, those of us at the table right now, in particular. And a couple of funny things happened to me along the way. I recently was asked to write this what's it called? The craft, the artist's craft, the scholar's craft, something like that, for Age Diplo. And so it's a very awkward thing to writing about yourself and your scholarship. And but a few funny things sort of came to mind as I've been thinking about this last 30 years in particular. One is August 1991, of course, is really kind of the beginning of the end of the fall. Depends on when you take it. You could take it with Gorbachev coming into power in March 1985. You could take it a little bit earlier in the 80s when the Saudis decide that they're going to let oil prices drop by flooding the market with oil and hurting the Soviet economy. For me, I guess there are two big points. In March 1985, I was an undergraduate at University of Toronto, and I was taking a class with Tim Colton, who's now at Harvard. And he came in and announced this new guy, Gorbachev, was taking over the Politburo. And wow, he got out of his limousine and he shook people's hands and he showed us his wife. And this was also very different. And then Tim, of course, went on, and if he's watching, sorry, but it's true, but I still think he's fabulous, wrote a book about why the Soviet Union had a lot of problems, but wasn't imminently going to collapse. So as we look at the 30 years and we try to predict my last question, where are we going? I'm going to try and evade that. Can I move this forward? I don't on. I can do it for you. Okay, I think I'm too far away, maybe. All right, so the second sort of punctuation for me was August 1991. I happened to actually just, again, sorry, Tim Colton's part of this story too. I happened to be house sitting as a graduate student at this point at Harvard. And it was Tim's house by chance. I was house sitting for, and there was a big hurricane. I'm not sure if anyone remembers this, Boston in 1991, August. And his wife had just gotten a new car apparently, and it had been lent to me as a third-year graduate student. And unfortunately, a tree came down and literally broke the car on the day of the coup attempt started, August 19th. And I had to break that to Tim. So not only was his car broken, was the Soviet Union breaking, but I saw my career as a graduate student crashing in front of my eyes as well. But he was quite forgiving about this and said, next time park it in the garage. The other thing is, since we talked about this, in 1991, in December of 1991, I was just thinking, where was I? I was teaching, a teaching assistant at Harvard in an undergraduate class on the Soviet Union. And we watched basically this Ukrainian referendum happen, and that was it. So a lot of us had to scramble around rather desperately to change our dissertation topics. You might remember this painful process. So if you're a graduate student, you can do it when you really, really have to. People who are counting bombs kind of didn't have topics anymore. I was going to work on local government, local party organization. This seems really revolutionary, to be able to actually work on the party at the local level. No one really done it since the all inside. And then, of course, there weren't any local party organizations anymore to study. So I ended up studying local government, which was fascinating. By the way, 30 years later, I'm not sure I have the same access. In fact, I can't, as an American/Canadian, have the same access to local governments as I did in the early 90s for that book, which was my dissertation. So 30 years ago, where were we? How bad were things internally? Very, very bad. I'll show that to you in a moment. Some of you might remember seeing friends in late 1991 and fall of 1991 into 1992 who were stacking, hoarding things, using barter trade. I had a friend who was actually an economist, but he, for some reason, had bars of soap stacked up next to the door of his apartment. Somehow he got me some work and he was bartering it for different things. That didn't last very long, of course, but there was a huge dip in economic activity, a recession. Where have we gone? I'm showing everyone's, I wasn't going to say favorite dictator because now there's so many to choose from, but the one everyone knows and fears, Vladimir the Lucky, saying that Russia has gotten better and better over time. And this is the best quote here, I think, is developmentally, in just 30 years, we have undergone changes that have taken centuries in other countries. So I thought, since we are here, the 30-year mark, someone else here is cognizant of it being 30 years as well. And here are his boasts through his time in power about Russia's recovery. From how it started in the economy and the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was, of course, a complete collapse of the economy. It was a recession that was described by some as the worst economic catastrophe outside of wartime, human-made, that is, except now for Venezuela. That's not a competition you really want to be in, of course. Russia was receiving food aid, it was dependent on IMF loans, lenders of last resort, World Bank as well. It was trying to be the successor state in international relations to the Soviet Union. And I guess this is where I would start a ceremonial joust with you, Michael, and say that, how are we defining revolution here? You're implying that there was no storming of the Bastille and there should have been violence, perhaps. And this was not a violent change of government. I think it's a pretty violent, I think it's a pretty marked change in governments, in society, and certainly in economics. So I would say, gosh, that strikes me as a revolution. Oops, can you move me forward one? Thanks. So we go, where has Russia been? Question one. From an economic collapse to recovery. It's been an unsteady recovery. I don't want to exaggerate it, but in a second, I'm going to show you the arc of recovery because I think it's a little underappreciated. Improving human development, I'm going to show you that in a moment as well. And we get a slight decline in independence oil revenues into the budget in the last few years. I don't want to exaggerate diversification, but there has been some. And if we want to understand where we are in Russia right now and where it's going, we do have to sort of appreciate its strengths and its vulnerabilities. Oh, one more slide. There we go. So here's GDP. I told you I could act this out without slides. This is GDP per capita in thousands of US dollars, international dollars adjusted. It's shown in US dollars adjusted at purchasing power parity, right? So that's if you buy worry about pressing a button here. If you buy a basket of goods in one country, what it would cost in local currency in the other country, and then convert it. This is just World Bank data, and what it shows you is we get this sort of transitional U curve right here, and then from about 1997, 99, even though there's an economic crash then and a loan default, you can see even before Putin comes into power, in 1999 we have the first year of growth, and then, well, I'm not even moving that arrow, and see about that. And then 2003 to 2008, big growth in Russia. That's on the back of very high oil prices. So an interesting counterfactual to think about is if in the 1990s, the average oil price had not been $17 a barrel, but it had gotten up as high as it did about $117 a barrel between 2003 and 2008, how would things have gone for liberalization and democratization? I'm not sure, but we can talk about it hopefully. So we get this big jump up. Economic crisis, global economic crisis. Things go a little bit bad for Russia because its customers are doing badly as well. But then look, growth goes up again. And I think this is sometimes underappreciated, right? When we think about why is Putin popular, well, there are lots of reasons, but this is definitely one. We're seeing what some people call stagnation now. This is the COVID effect. But look, even here, we're still growing. Russia was under sanctions by the US and the European Union from 2014 onward. Look at the growth is still going up. So that's significant. And I think just, it's not a hard graph to find, just that means something. Now, I firmly believe if Russia had a different political and economic system, and I'll get to this by the end, that it economically could be doing even better, of course, because we can go to the next slide. You'll see there's a lot of corruption as well. This is just showing you some perspective that Russia is here in blue. This is purchasing power parity, GDP per capita, comparing Russia to Brazil, China, Russia, India, and European Union. That's the EU 28. So per capita, we talk about how well China has done, and undeniably well, but Russians are wealthier than the average Chinese. Right, so people's lives have changed fundamentally in the post-Soviet, post-collapse period. Wages right now are a bit stagnant. There's tremendous inequality. I'm not going to show you that, but trust me, I can show you that in terms of wealth inequality, and obviously staggering under a very heavy COVID burden now, estimated as of yesterday, 1 million excess deaths, presumably from COVID. So all of that is problematic for everyone else as well, though, remember, right? So that's something. Even as oil prices decreased in this area, in this period, we still got growth. Okay, next slide. People's lives have fundamentally changed. This is the Human Development Index of the United Nations produces. I just went to 2017, partly because I took this from my book, which goes 2017, 19 in terms of numbers. But here we can see things like life expectancy, something we wrote about a lot as a problem in the early 2000s, has begun to turn around rather significantly. The gross national income per capita, again, going up, and education, average education levels also going up. Now, in terms of competitiveness, I have a lot in my book on this, but with education, Russia only has one university in the global top 100. So, not there, but there are a lot of foreign students still going to Russia, particularly from developing countries, especially when the Russian government is paying for it. So, well, all that's been relatively positive. the trends in democratic quality, state role in the economy, these things are different, right? So what we can see is gradually, and in particular from 2010-11 onward, an increase in the state's role in the economy. This is a deprivatization, generally of large oil, gas, and other natural resource firms. We can see other indices like free and fair elections, freedom of civil society, independent media, independent judiciary, all gradually declining. So it's almost contra modernization theory, right? You're supposed to, when a country gets wealthier and healthier, and people are supposed to demand accountability in government, demand protection over what they have accumulated, and you should get responsible representative institutions, political parties, parliaments, open and free civil society, and all of those other good things. But in Russia, that's not what we've got. We've gotten a reversal that most things started to happen around 2005, in Putin's second term as president. Next slide. Another big issue is perceptions of corruption. Obviously, corruption is a very difficult thing to measure. Corruption did not start with Russia in 1991 or 1992. There's a long history in the, I don't want to touch this, the Soviet and imperial periods of using the state for private gain. But you can see that the darker red you are here, the worse corrupted you are. If you get to burgundy, you're really bad. So Russia's pretty dark red, indicating pretty high levels of corruption. Of course, that hurts foreign direct investment as well. Even without that, though, Russia's still growing. Why? Because there's some countries who don't care about that. And those countries are in the Gulf, Persian Gulf. So who's investing in Russia now? China, not Persian Gulf, of course, but Saudi Arabia, UAE, etc. Next slide. So the weak spot, I think, in terms of where we are now in Russia. Okay, so the economy a little unsteady, but I just showed you pretty, steady growth even well under sanctions. So the sanctions, as we think about Mr. Putin speaking with Mr. Biden tomorrow over the Ukraine issue, great time, by the way, get them to do that the day after we meet here. The sort of intriguing thing is what effect actually have those sanctions had on Russian growth. You can see they're still growing. Now they definitely hurt, probably could have grown more. Clearly the Russians don't like them, but it's not exactly crippling their economy. Why they've looked elsewhere for partners, and that's something maybe we can talk about when we think of where Russia is now and how far it's come since the collapse of the Soviet Union. In terms of Russia's kind of recovery, the social society or social means of power of this particular regime now under Mr. Putin over the last 20 years has rendered society kind of the weak spot or the particularly unpredictable point. So life expectancy, as I mentioned, has gotten better, but it's still far below the European Union. It's even far below China in terms of life expectancy. And I think we can also point to the COVID crisis to note that the healthcare system is rather uneven as well. Life expectancy stayed about the same. Now it's about where it was in 1970. Male life expectancy is a particular issue. This is from bad habits, as Ed Sheeran would say. Yes, smoking and drinking, both of which actually they have long been sort of intractable problems, but the government has attacked these. So I think too often it is posited that the Russian government can't get anything done. That's not true. It can get some things done quite well, really good with repressive power, as the Russian opposition knows at the moment. But they are actually good with some other policies as well, and one of them has been their anti-tobacco reform and trying to decrease the very, very heavy smoking that was going on, especially with women, actually, but men very high per capita, one of the highest per capita smoking populations in the world. So they've attacked that. They've also gotten Russians at least to switch more to beer and wine from spirits. So this has started to increase life expectancy. And the leading causes of death are preventable disease. Unfortunately, in terms of labor productivity for Russia, they're hitting at the height of when a Russian male should be at their most productive. So here in the United States, people die of cardiovascular disease as well, but it tends to be later in life. In Russia, it's younger, the problem starts younger, and so their productive output isn't as high. Okay. In terms of another vulnerability where we are now, I in my book call this, after Henry Hale, a patronal autocracy. That is a system of patronage, essentially, that is a pyramid that ends in Putin. His approval in society is a resource that he can use against other elites. And so I just put on this graph here a few punctuation points and his approval, disapproval ratings over time. Now, I'll note that that's different than trust. His trust rating has traditionally been quite good. This past week, I believe it's fallen to just around 20%. Still higher than the next highest, but for him, that's a significant drop. He's still the most trusted politician in Russia, though. In terms of approval, oops, let me go back. In terms of approval, though, it's hanging out around 60%. So we can discuss why that is, whether it's real. Tim Fry has an interesting paper, and it's in his book as well. That's just come out this year. Weak Strong Man, talking about Putin. We have, we think this is real. He did some experiments on getting people to point out who they admire most in a list of leaders, and when they added Putin to the list to the treatment group, the numbers stayed pretty close to what these polls are showing. So we have reason to think it's real. Whether it's manipulated because of the exposure to the media, which is controlled by the state, that's a good question. But especially when you compare this approval to the next highest approval, which I think might be Michigan right now, the prime minister, it's 30 to 40 points higher. So COVID is hitting hard, and Putin's obviously not, his trust ratings have gone down. Why? We don't exactly know, but we can talk about that. But that's certainly a vulnerability as well. When we think about revolutions, how they happen, it's presumably better for his approval rating to be much higher than it is for it to be low, better for trust to be higher than it is to be low. And we can try to understand why it is that there's been more repression against the opposition in the last year or so. Maybe also when we think about why there are maybe up to 175,000 troops on the border between Ukraine and Russia. So some would argue that it does boost domestic ratings, does boost domestic standing if he can call the attention of the President of the United States to him and get exactly the kind of meeting that he's getting tomorrow. Discuss the situation and supposed aggression on the part of NATO, but there he is with the most powerful man in the world negotiating. So this would be good for his PR domestically. Okay, next slide. So if we again think of how political change happens, it can be gradual or it can be sudden. And I was just telling Steve Hawking that I've been listening and reading his books on Stalin and listening to them. And we should remember there's a short term and a long term, right? So 17 years before the October Revolution, Lenin was in Europe, and he spent those 17 years, right, in Europe. Back in the spring of 1917 to that famous Finland Station steel train thing. Trotsky too. Stalin in jail. So Navalny in jail. The other members of the Russian opposition are in exile. We have some actually even in Palo Alto hanging out. So political change out of autocracy can happen, but sometimes it's a very long process. Russia has persistent developmental issues that it hasn't solved. Corruption's obviously a big one. That's something people mention all the time in surveys. I took this quote from Putin saying that he views change in Russia as desirable only evolutionarily, not suddenly. And he uses this: we've overfilled the plan when it comes to revolution. His goal is stability because he gains from the current system, and we've seen he gains personally and materially from controlling the Russian state, and those around him also gain personally and materially. And so his goal is to keep things the way they are. How do you do that? Well, if you can't keep society fat and happy and economic growth going, then you repress as needed. And so we can see them dialing up repression, dialing it down with the opposition. That's not, I think, a sign of a particularly stable or confident regime that has to be done at this particular moment. Investment in human capital, something we think about as necessary for sustainable growth, very uneven, underinvestment in research and development, and a disconnect between research institutions and some of the large technical companies that have emerged. When you think about the development of Silicon Valley, for example, and new economies, there's a very tight relationship between universities and industry. They don't have that in Russia. I think at this point, they're not, obviously not an innovative or even an imitative economy in the way that China has a competent but not an excellent higher education system. Most number of engineers per capita, but the definition of engineer is somewhat uncertain. And as I mentioned, demography is a pretty mixed picture. I could show you the, oops, can you bring that back, plus? I could show you the so-called population pyramid. A healthy population has wider at the base, right? Younger people, and then gradually you have fewer and fewer older people. Russia's population pyramid kind of goes like that. So much thinner at the base, relatively low fertility rates, and high mortality rates at a younger age. So when you think about things like production, that's a problem, right? Labor output, that's a problem longer term. Ultimately, what brings autocracies down? So as we look into the future, this may be a brittle. We didn't predict the collapse of the Soviet Union after all of those. Some people post-hoc seem to have predicted. Is it imminent, the collapse of the Russian autocracy that has emerged in the last 20 years? No, probably not imminent. Is it possible? Very much so. The biggest issue, of course, is changing the leadership. And no one lives forever, not even Vladimir Putin. He's now 69 years old. So he's coming up on the average life expectancy of the Russian male. He definitely exercises more. We have reason to think he's healthy, but he has not, it's cause for speculation, he's not designated as successor. This is an uninstitutionalized system, right? The parties don't have a process. And so it's not clear who would succeed him and continue this sort of system. So although Russia has resurrected in many ways, the political system that has come to take place, what we hoped for in the 1990s, that is a more liberalized and pluralistic and democratic system, has evolved into this personalistic formal autocracy that is itself, I would say, quite fragile. How about that?
Olga, you're next.
Okay, thank you. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. And I'm trying to keep an eye on the time as well. So I'm slightly envious of those of you gathered there in apparently balmy weather in DC. But thank you for this invitation, and really an invitation to think about something that is worth thinking about, which is the benefits of and costs of historical perspective. On this distinguished panel, I represent sociology, but I actually have to start with a disclaimer that I feel like I'm speaking to you and also thinking about the question that you've asked us to consider from a sort of safe, undisclosed disciplinary location somewhere between anthropology, sociology, and history. And I'll start from also kind of a personal story to explain why. And that story takes us appropriately to today's topic, to 1991. Which was particularly to the summer of 1991. This was when I graduated from high school, where I was fortunate to have a pretty broad choice of topics for my composition, the Russian exams, exit exams, where I actually got to write about Shalamov. And I'm mentioning this because I think this conjures sort of a sense of just how different the Soviet Union in which I was graduating was from the Soviet Union where I started my schooling. And that same year, I did enter the sociology department of the Moscow State University. So I'm sort of a sociologist from, before the time I really knew what sociology was. So it was a wild bet. The department had been in existence for only 2 years. At that point, it hadn't graduated a class yet. And here I was at sort of a newly minted sociology major in August 19th, sitting at the dacha with my good friend Lena, and without electricity, listening to the portable radio, which is producing its coverage of the putsch that is happening in real time, and thinking to myself, what the heck was I thinking? Choosing sociology and sort of pondering what kind of sociology I would be studying in this sort of newly closing moment of sort of conservative retrenchment and reaction. So fortunately for me, it was the putsch that was defeated that August and not sociology. But to me, it I think was a kind of a formative moment that made me ask sociological questions, because having lived through a dissolution of what was widely been perceived as a stable, almost eternal world of late socialism, I never quite shook off this fascination with how complex moral, social, and symbolic universes evolve and are legitimized, and also an acute awareness that these universes are inevitably finite, and perhaps more importantly, never static. So much of my work since then had dealt with specific sites in which questions of meaning and moral worth are negotiated and resolved in the post-socialist context, particularly in the midst of the fundamental uncertainty and sort of shifting economic, cultural, and political landscape of the first post-socialist decade. And I came to see everyday life with sort of everything that it entailed, consumption decisions, political talk, and so on, as something that's more than a mere adaptation to a broken social order, but rather a kind of a process of social and cultural production, in which people's tactical ways of making do add up to form new social and cultural universes. And so in this way, kind of sociology became an intuitive way for me to make sense of this rapidly changing world around me, both in undergraduate and my graduate work, which I did at the Department of Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, where my dissertation, which later became a book, looked at the changing structures of everyday life and everyday sort of shifting notions of what constituted competence, safety, and personhood in this rapidly shifting landscape. However, what I discovered very quickly in my graduate career is that sociologists in the US predominantly worked on the US. And so if you worked on the questions that interested me in suburban Detroit or Philadelphia, you were a sociologist. But if you're working on these same questions in Russia, you were a Russianist. An area study and a study person. And if you were anything disciplinary at all, you were an anthropologist. So I found myself sort of naturally in conversation with anthropologists, even though there's a sort of a small but very distinguished group of sociologists in the US working on Russia. And unfortunately, I can't name all of them, but certainly Ted Gerber, Jane Zawiska, Michael Burawoy are sort of exceptions, but predominantly, particularly because I was doing ethnography, I was really hanging out with anthropologists who had sort of the time to do field work and the expectations to kind of undergo language training that would sort of enable them to do this kind of work. And so by holding on to my disciplinary toolkit and research object, which was the first post-socialist decade in Russia, I felt like I sort of became an anthropologist by default. And now I'm sort of observing myself undergoing a similar kind of transformation without necessarily shifting my analytical gaze from the both location and the time period of late socialism and early post-socialism, because now 30 years after 1991, of course, this period is becoming now a sort of a proper object of interest for historians. And so I'm more and more frequently find myself in conversation with historians. It's not a bad thing. And in fact, it's a very exciting thing because it brings in a very wide domain of expertise and very exciting disciplinary conversations to the topics that I had originally thought about as sociological, even though I tried to approach them, I think, with a sort of a historian sense of the longue durée, and also with an eye to sort of missed or kind of coexisting multiple possible trajectories and opportunities. I'm also hoping that, as I go into the field now and ask these questions about perestroika and the post-Soviet experience, I won't have to acquire an IRB approval, which has been the bane of my existence as a sociologist, because sneakily historians have managed to get an exemption from oral history that sociologists and anthropologists don't get. So there are lots of potential benefits to this transformation, but also I think kind of an invitation to consider what happens when a particular moment in time attracts this kind of interdisciplinary gaze. And I should mention that the book that I'm currently I'm co-writing with a fellow historian, Oksana Sarkisova of Central European University, where we're looking at basically sort of the politics of memory of socialism through the prism of people's private memories and private photographic archives. So in some ways, I'm being sort of more of a historian in this project than I was in my dissertation work. But so having made these disclaimers, I want to return to the original set of questions that Michael asked us to consider and to reflect on how historical distance and perspective in a way shape one's vision, shape both the kinds of questions that we ask and the answers that we can distinguish or see. Perspective and distance are sort of metaphors from everyday life. And I think we know from our everyday experience that you certainly see things differently when you see them at a certain remove, right? You see them in a more sort of complex, comprehensive, interconnected, systemic way. But you also don't necessarily see better, right? You see differently. So to me, this is also an invitation to think about what we see perhaps a little bit less or have to make a bit more of an effort to distinguish from that historical remove. But to start from some of the things that I think we see more crisply, looking at particularly the moment of regime change, 1991, from a 30-year removed, I feel like we're better posed to ask sort of the big picture questions. And it's not a coincidence that we're seeing sort of a crop of exciting kind of retrospective books that put both the regime change and the sort of subsequent transformations into this sort of big picture perspective. So we're better posed, I think, to ask questions about causality, right? Questions about what led to USSR's end. Better posed to ask questions about the roles of specific groups and perhaps even fractions within those groups as the sort of the final years of perestroika were taking their shape and look at what these different groups sort of brought to the table and how they may have sort of tipped the balance one way or another in the final years of the USSR. And the final subset of these sort of big picture questions is sort of questions about the interplay between determinism and contingency, or the role of agency in both the undoing of the USSR and the shape that the new post-socialist order was to take in the early years of the transformation. And this is not just because we're removed, but we're also getting access to different kinds of sources, a broader array of sources, oral histories. People are sort of more willing to think retrospectively about their particular experience of the fall of the USSR and the role that they may have played with it. Some archives are becoming available. A lot of personal documents are becoming available and sort of publicly accessible as well. So in that sense, they're sort of inevitably, I think, going to change the way in which we think about both USSRs and the transition that followed. The second cluster of questions that I think we are sort of poised to think differently about is the lasting legacy of certain late Soviet practices, particularly because there's sort of a longer span of times over which we've sort of seen them play out. So, for example, I find myself now much more so than in the 1990s when I was writing my dissertation, asking myself questions about the legacies of late Soviet ways of thinking about economic difference, about inequality, about privilege, and the ways in which they sort of crop up today at this moment where the economic and class structure of the now post-socialist Russia is really crystallizing, and we're about to witness what sociologist Elizabeth Schimpfosel had called the single biggest transfer of assets within the smallest group of people ever to have occurred in history. And so as we do so, I think it's worth pondering both kind of direct continuities, right? The ways in which certain views on sort of egalitarianism or legitimacy or illegitimacy of dramatic wealth discrepancies, the importance of interdependence or mutual aid crop up both in sort of critiques of the post-socialist order coming from sort of traditional Zyuganov style left, but also from groups and supporters of Alexei Navalny, for example, and the ways in which they're sort of inflected with some of the Soviet era sort of views on distribution and social justice. On the reverse side, too, I think that the obsession with sort of eliteness in various shapes and forms and the infinite gradations thereof are also incomprehensible without thinking of the legacy of both late socialist sort of deficits and deprivations, but also to a certain extent the legacy of critiques of capitalism. So that sort of anti-capitalist propaganda that perhaps got embraced in very uncritical ways by the new post-socialist elites. And here I'm thinking about the sort of frequent refrain that everything they told us about socialism was a lie, but everything they told us about capitalism was true. And the ways in which some of the both sort of political economy of the post-socialist period, but also individual sort of ways, unapologetic ways of embracing inequality and exclusion and maybe resistance to thinking about social justice may kind of hark back paradoxically to some of the successes of Soviet propaganda in the most unexpected places. Some other things that I think are sort of worth thinking about as we sort of observe the 30 years past the regime change is generational dynamics. And again, this is something that's only becoming, I think, sort of palpable today, but the generational dynamics of making sense of perestroika, of socialism, of the regime change and its aftermath. And I know that Kelly Smith would probably talk a lot more about this sort of shifting, perhaps generational frames on the past. But in that sense, the context in which 1991 and the early 90s are sort of remembered and spoke about really depends on the not just the person's generation, but also the moment in which one has this conversation. So in my interviews, for the dissertation, I sort of really heard about 1991 only in the context of kind of a reverse political socialization in which people spoke about their own political activity in the early 90s as a disappointment, as an example of how they were cheated and something that they would never come back to. Those very same people in 2012, speaking about either their own or their children's decision to sort of protest, during that wave of protests, spoke about that experience of 1991 as their sort of first experience of political activity and something to be sort of practiced and embraced. And today, as I know from today's students in Russia, 1990s is a trending hashtag on TikTok, and oftentimes is framed through the prism of sort of possibility or open-endedness of that political moment in a way that it was not talked about in the 1990s. So I'll be really telegraphic from now onwards. One last thing that I think we're really poised to think about is the legacies of post-socialism. So this is somewhat counter to what I've mentioned before. We've talked a lot and a lot has been written about legacies of socialism. It's time really to assess the aftermath of 1991 and the ways in which it was its own formative experience. And how the opportunities that were missed in that period or mismanaged are informing the crisis of trust, for example, a depoliticization that we're seeing today. Now, as far as what the historical distance obscures, again, very telegraphically, I think that it was easier to capture the sort of procedural feel of the regime change in the moment than it is right now. There's a danger that 1991 would sort of crystallize as a kind of a sharp turning point, whereas in people's narratives of that time, it very rarely has a kind of a privileged status as opposed to, let's say, 1989 or 1993. People experience these changes in a much more synthetic fashion. You know, commercial activity predated collapse, certain institutional practices far outlived it. So we have to kind of think against the grain to kind of preserve that sense of processual transformation. It's hard to capture the optimism of the early perestroika years and the sort of optimism that now kind of fuels a feeling of nostalgia for that period as something when sort of the future seemed much more open than it feels today. And it's hard to just capture the evolving structure of feeling sort of in situ. So that's a call to rediscover personal documents and diaries from the 1990s where people speak about their expectation of what the transitional period would be like, and where they sound very much like we all sounded in the first week of the pandemic in 2020 in March, where we thought, oh, several months and this will be over, right? In that case, it was several years and it will be over. And I think as the transformation continued to be turbulent, those sort of early optimistic hopes had really turned to stark disappointment. Whichever way we look at it, I think there's no God's eye view. We're still perceiving 1991 from our own current embedded perspective. It's still a situated knowledge. And so we're viewing it from today's moment of precarity and dramatic polarization, both politically and economically. And in that sense, we will probably continue to reflect on the Soviet project and its undoing with those concerns in mind, which I take as a guarantee of our job security. So on this, thank you.
Thank you. Let's go to Gotham City, Elliot.
Just a second. There we go. Okay, great. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Wonderful, thank you. So we're here today to commemorate the end of the Soviet Union, but you know how ritual commemorations are. You can't stop at just one. And even though it is several months too early, this occasion calls to my mind the Passover Seder. Every year, Jews get together to eat enormous crackers, stare at a center plate bedecked with remarkably unappetizing food, and remember the exodus from Egypt. And at every Seder, 4 questions are asked and answered. It is in this spirit that I wish to ask and only partially answer 4 questions about the end of the Soviet Union. Technically, the questioner is supposed to be the youngest person at the table, an honor I know I can't claim. Olga, I suspect that would be you, but it would be unfair to spring this on you without preparation. So maybe next year, if not in Jerusalem, then at least at Georgetown. A warning to purists, my questions are not modeled on the original Haggadah, so I will not be asking how is this collapse different from all other collapses. Instead, my questions, which arise out of my current research project, are as follows. 1, was the collapse, or to use the late Steve Cohen's preferred term, dismantling, of the Soviet Union a terrible disaster? 2, who was responsible? 3, 30 years later, can we still use the term post-Soviet? 4, did the Soviet Union really come to an end, or does it actually still exist? So, question 1. It'll probably come as no surprise to most of you that the general consensus one gets from watching Russian media and surfing the Runet is that the end of the Soviet Union was a tragedy. Putin himself got a great deal of flack in the Western media by referring to the event as крупнейшая геополитическая трагедия века in a 2005 speech, a phrase initially translated as the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the century, ignoring both the numerical ambiguity and superlatives such as крупнейший, as well as the absence of both definite and indefinite articles in the Russian language. One might as accurately render his words as one of the greatest geopolitical tragedies of the century, thus making room for the Holocaust and World War II, among others. Putin's words fit in well not only with the Russian leadership's overall approach to 1991 and the 9 years that followed, but also with the conception that laments the loss of the Soviet Union without necessarily being nostalgic for the Soviet system. Moreover, Putinism, with its emphasis on the centrality of the strong state as the guarantor of, if not prosperity, then at least continuity, has congealed into an ideology whose overall premises can shift at will, but whose protagonist is always the state itself. The state is the hero of the story of history, and the end of an iteration of statehood is a loss by definition. The past 2, if not 3 decades of post-Soviet life in the media have encouraged the idea that the populace naturally identifies with the state. On top of all the economic privation that the collapse of the Soviet Union led to, it was also a blow to popular affective affiliation, like when the home team loses a championship. When Mikhail Gorbachev eventually dies, Russian pundits will be lining up to spit on his grave. Question 2. Contempt for Gorbachev leads us to question 2, who is to blame for the end of Soviet power? Gorbachev is the obvious candidate, though that line of thinking fits more with the debates surrounding the country's future during perestroika. We should recall that China offered a very different model for revitalizing a communist country, one that appealed to pragmatists who were less concerned with democratic norms. Rather than liberalize the media and public sphere, might it not be better to liberalize the economy while retaining central authority and a tight grip on the media and culture? The consolidation of Putinism is an implicit validation of those in the late 1980s who thought that China had made the wiser choice. But this is mere politics, and to most people, politics are boring. The real excitement is in the moral melodrama peddled by conspiracy theories. As I've argued repeatedly, conspiracy theories are not just an overly systemized model of the world, they're also inherently optimistic. If your country is falling apart, the economy is ruined, and the world is going to hell in a handbasket, there is no comfort in contingency. A random, chaotic world is much scarier than one masterminded by demonic forces. If there's someone to blame, there's also someone to fight. Thanks to the conspiracy theories that were already bubbling to the surface in the late Soviet years, along with the general assumption that the real truth is always hidden, finding someone to blame for the Soviet collapse was easy. If anything, American leaders made it even easier by actually taking credit for the end of the Soviet Union, as if this were the result of excellent long-term planning. Only 2 decades after 1991, the idea that Gorbachev was a paid agent of the CIA on a mission to destroy the USSR had become common enough not to raise eyebrows. And this is not just about history. It is a way of understanding current and recent events. The Kremlin's reflexive habit of blaming every manifestation of dissent on paid agents of George Soros, Hillary Clinton, or the dreaded US State Department, whose Russian translation, Gosdepartament, is often pronounced with such venom that it might as well be Voldemort, both relies on and reinforces the idea that the West in general, and the US in particular, have been working to destroy Soviet and Russian statehood for decades. The panics over color revolutions as the work of American political technologists makes sense if you posit that the first successful color revolution took place in 1991. Question number 3. 30 years on, is it still appropriate to use the term post-Soviet and more broadly post-socialist? The terms post-socialist and post-Soviet have a built-in limitation in that the post suggests an expiration date that comes sooner rather than later. It only took a few years after 1989/1991 for people to start claiming that the terms were passé. The haste with which the terms were declared invalid is rather suspicious. While I would not wish to deny that conditions have changed significantly in the past decade, there is something symptomatic about the desire to declare the phenomenon a feature of the past. In 2012, Putin even went so far as declaring the post-Soviet period to be over, a statement which has a virtue of its own, reminding a Putin-obsessed West that just because the Russian president says something, that does not mean he has the power to make it actually happen. It is simply too early to tell if Putin's third and fourth terms, not to mention the Ukrainian crises, truly represent a new era for Russia. This is not just a matter of prematurity, but is complicated by the fact that any such declaration represents a decisive stance in ongoing political debates. And given the vehemence with which Putin's people have vilified the first post-Soviet decade, a more limited spin on Putin's word has some merit. What is over is not the post-Soviet, what is over is the 1990s. For what it's worth, I suspect that 50 or 60 years from now, people will talk of Russia's long 21st century, setting its starting date at or around 1991. I find this preferable because it is based on measurements of time rather than premature assessments of ideological shifts, even if the period's beginning is marked by an event whose ideological import is undeniable. But my own prediction is even more premature than the race to declare post-socialism's demise. Any attempt to attach the adjective long to a century that is only beginning its third decade is on the face of it ludicrous. As a term, post-Soviet is initially meaningless, but so was Soviet, from the Russian word for council. It was appropriated by the Bolsheviks out of naked opportunism. Post-Soviet eventually means something from the sheer accumulation of instances of its use. Finally, the question that must strike most of you as particularly bizarre. Did the Soviet Union really collapse? For the past decade, a number of groups known under the umbrella name Citizens of the USSR have insisted that the Soviet Union is still alive, if not exactly well. As many anti-liberals have said since 1991, the people who declared the Soviet Union dead had no legal standing to do so. Among other arguments, the leaders of the three Slavic republics did not have the constitutional authority to declare the Soviet Union defunct. I don't have time to go into the history of these groups, though rest assured, it is hilarious. Suffice to say that it started with a dentist who declared himself acting president of the USSR while he was on trial for financial malfeasance, before becoming a YouTube star for the elderly and gullible. Numerous imitators popped up, and I'm sure you will not be surprised to hear that they fight with each other constantly. Their appeal is based on nostalgia, of course, but also on economics. Since the Russian Federation is an illegal entity squatting on a large chunk of Soviet territory, Soviet citizens are under no obligation to pay any bills they might owe to the Russian Federation. In other words, Soviet citizens are on an extended utility strike. Of course, these same Soviet citizens have no qualms about receiving their Russian Federation pensions, nor do their leaders hesitate to bilk them of said pensions by charging them anywhere from 2,000 to 4,000 rubles, about $25 to $50, for a newly issued Soviet internal passport. Yes, you too can get a Soviet internal passport today if you pay the right money. Numerous commentators have demonstrated the ideological links between the citizens of the USSR in the post-Soviet space, the Reichsbürger movement in Germany, and the various sovereign citizens groups active around the United States. All three reject the generally recognized statehood of their respective countries in favor of a previous constitution or legal framework that they claim has never been invalidated. But where the sovereign citizens can display unalloyed contempt for the very idea of federal documentation, the citizens of the USSR find themselves engaged in the balancing act. As their very name suggests, their identity is based on the concept of a powerful central state. The sovereigns look back to a time when the federal government left them alone, while the citizens of the USSR long for the days of a lost great power. If we think of the state as a figurative parent, the sovereigns are playing at parricide, while the citizens of the USSR demand the return of the prodigal dad. While there are no doubt plenty of Stalinists among the citizens of the USSR, as well as others who are committed to their understanding of the tenets of communism, expecting the entire movement to display such ideological dedication is to fall into the trap that so often awaits liberal observers of conspiracy theories. We search in vain for ideological consistency when what we should really be looking for is affect. The citizens' appeal is emotional, not logical, which is one of the reasons they can't be disillusioned through argument. Yet there is still a very potent irony about this USSR that lacks a coherent political program. However much Soviet practice deviated from Soviet theory, the historical USSR was dependent on the idea of an ideology to an unprecedented extent. The citizens either cannot come to a consensus or cannot be bothered to dwell on social and economic theory. The contours of their USSR might resemble utopia in that it is both idealized and unrealized, but modern utopias, while often mirroring an imagined golden age, have tended to look forward to the creation of something new. Borrowing from the title of Edward Bellamy's famous utopian novel, the citizens of the USSR are looking backward in every sense of the phrase's meaning. They want what they have lost, decent living standards and pride in a powerful country. Everything else is just the fine print. Thank you.
Sorry, the removal of the mask is even more complicated than the putting on of the mask. All right, I will be brief. That's a promise. Let's see how I can do it. All right, so as I prepared for today's event, I started thinking about the geography of the very end of the Soviet Union. And here I have no personal anecdote because I have returned from a long stretch of dissertation research at the end of June and thereby missed the August events, much to my dismay. So in thinking about this, admittedly from a Russian perspective, the first thing that came to my mind's eye was the image of crowds building the barricades in front of the Russian White House and people worrying about the coup plotters' potential military might. Then I recalled how a few nights later, the statue of Dzerzhinsky dangled as if from a noose as heavy equipment safely removed it from the hands of a jubilant crowd that was trying to tip it over. I also thought about how Byelovej Forest became synonymous with a secret meeting where the heads of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus took the decisive step to dissolve the already teetering union. Now let's think about 2021 and this geography. So the Russian White House is no longer the head of the Russian legislature, and that institution, in fact, is rightly nicknamed the crazy printer for the poor quality and one-sided law that it spews out. The Russian White House is now the home of the presidential administration. Also in 2021, there was a referendum started in Moscow that asked people to choose between putting back Dzerzhinsky in front of the FSB building on Lubyanka Square or choosing a new statue of Alexander Nevsky. And as 2021 comes to an end, a few blocks away from Lubyanka Square in front of the Russian Supreme Court, a man was arrested for holding a sign that said, "We are Memorial," and he was protesting here at the state's attempt to shut down Russia's best-known human rights and historical justice association. He got 24 days in prison, but an appeal last week reduced his sentence by, wait for it, an hour. So never let it be said that there is no judicial mercy in Russia. And last but not least, in late 2021, Byelovej is a place where an obdurate dictatorial Belarusian government is deliberately pushing hungry and cold migrants over the Polish border to rattle Europe. So our guest last week, Vlad Zubak, had a lot to say about what happened during the Soviet collapse, and I'm not going to touch on that next 10 minutes. Instead, what I want to do is make some observations about how the events of 1990 and 91 were remembered and commemorated in the first decade of Russian independence and how they've been forgotten or repackaged in the Putin era. And as my geographic ruminations have suggested, I want to link post-Soviet phenomenon to the fate of narratives about the nature of 91 and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I'm going to do this by talking about commemorative holidays, that is, dates in the state calendar that mark historical events. Now, political scientists not only love slides, I'll pick these slides for today, they also, for reasons unclear to me, love the Trinity. You have to have three of everything. And so I'm going to start by dissecting three commemorative holidays that came out of the destruction of the communist system and the end of the Soviet Union. And then I'll contrast them to what's actually popular commemorative holidays in Russia today. And I'll ask you to think about what principles are reflected in this sort of historical duel. So 2 months after the failed coup, the Russian legislature passed a law making October 30th the day of remembrance of victims of repression. And they chose this day because back in 1974, inmates in Perm and Mordovan prison camps had chosen this day for hunger strikes.
as part of their demand to be recognized as political prisoners. So nowadays, this holiday still exists. And if you went to an official commemoration or you watched the state news coverage on that day, what you would see is generally members of the elite, not your top ranking political leaders, but some lower down political guys, and usually representatives of the Russian Orthodox Church lighting candles or saying a prayer. And meanwhile, there's another form of commemoration. That one was invented by the Memorial Society, and it's a participatory one. So people line up starting early in the morning in front of the Slavic stone, a rock that was brought from Slavic in 1990 and put in front of the Lubyanka, not right where Dzerzhinsky stood, but a little bit kind of off to the sides, a little hidden in the bushes. You got to look for it, frankly. And what they do there is people take turns reciting the names of those who were executed during the terror. And it's a very interesting act because it allows for both the very individual and yet the scope of the event from early morning to late in the night and the number of people who participate also give a sense of the scope of that tragedy. And I will say that in the early 90s, this holiday was also marked by politicians and activists who come to the same Slavic stone on October 30th, but make political speeches. So nowadays, that kind of Hyde Park is not allowed, and there aren't so many Democratic politicians around who want to go to such a festival of free speech. So the holiday is really bifurcated between these short official moments of mourning and then the civic. The second commemorative holiday that's connected to a deep change in the political system arose even earlier. It was created in the summer of 1991, again by the Russian legislature, and they made June 12th the Day of Russian Sovereignty. And it was supposed to mark the fact that a year earlier it had passed this decree and also served as giving a non-working day to people to vote in the first election for Russian president. And later, Yeltsin, in fact, jokingly called this his jubilee, his jubilee of becoming president. But frankly, in the 1990s, this holiday really didn't have much meaning for citizens. And when I studied commemorative holidays, what I found is every year squads of journalists would go out in the street and ask people like, do you know what day it is? And do you know what it stands for? And the answer was always, no idea. Haven't the foggiest clue. Day of sovereignty. What is sovereignty? It just had no resonance whatsoever. And excuse me, those political commentators who didn't know what the day stood for really hated it because they said that celebrating sovereignty or independence was something that colonies did, but Russia had been the center of the empire. So why should they celebrate this day in which they had lost the empire? So this holiday, in case you're wondering, it still exists, but it's now called Russia Day, which I love because if you take the word sovereignty out, it's just like, yay, Russia Day. And why not? It's a nice sentiment, but it really has no content. And not surprisingly, it has no tradition. There's nothing to do on Russia Day except Russia or enjoy your day off. And then lastly, on this revamped commemorative calendar from the Yeltsin years, there's the day of the Russian state flag, which is marked on August 22nd. And you might guess, if you've been paying attention to our stories about the August coup, that this date is connected to the defeat of the August Putsch, and that is correct. But you might not guess that this holiday didn't arise out of some jubilation about the defeat of the coup plotters, but only came into being in 1994. And that was after this disastrous conflict between the president and the parliament left the Russian White House not so white anymore, but really scorched black from the firing from the army against the recalcitrant parliamentarians. And so only then in 94 did Yeltsin, as he put it, responding to the veterans of 1991, make the defense of the White House a holiday for them. So when I wrote some 20 years ago already about collective memory under Yeltsin, I was critical of the so-called Democrats for their really laissez-faire attitude towards promoting collective memories of the civic aspects of August 1991. So there was an association of defenders of the White House, but they didn't really have any money. They sponsored a few rock concerts in the early 90s and then drifted into obscurity. The state gave out some medals. There is a small marker on an overpass near the White House, marking where 3 young men were killed in the defense of the White House. But there's really no narrative, either from the Yeltsin period or today, that actually recalls that this was a set of days when large numbers of people stood up for democratic ideals. When Yeltsin, who frankly despised Gorbachev, called for constitutionality and the safe return of the president, as opposed to saying, you know, I'm in charge, I'm seizing power. So if August is mentioned nowadays, it seems to be presented as farce, a mistake, some kind of confusing dispute among elites, and as Georgetown's own Harley Walsh documented in an article some years ago, as a minor happening that only really affected Moscow and St. Petersburg, rather than as an event that sparked strikes, meetings, cities, and regions across the Russian Federation. So if you look by contrast at the commemorative holidays of Putin's Russia, you know, Victory Day, of course, wins hands down for media attention and celebrations. In fact, so much has been written about Victory Day and the cult of World War II, and I'm not even going to tell you anything about it, except to mention that it is the most participatory holiday in Russia, and it's the most cross-generational, in my opinion, because you have parades with past soldiers, present soldiers, and future soldiers. And by future soldiers, I mean very small children from preschool age up, who now, in a trendy way, wear costumes of World War II soldiers, nurses, or what have you. So that is your one great holiday. But there's a second commemorative holiday that's been highlighted by Putin, and that is November 4th, the Day of National Unity, which he created in 2004. And with this innovation, Putin swept away Yeltsin's half-hearted makeover of the November 7th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. And this happened in '96 after Yeltsin had just managed to squeak re-election past the communist candidate, Zyuganov. He survived his quadruple or quintuple, some enormous number of bypasses, and immediately, practically upon coming out of the operating room, said, you know, now we have to promote unity, and he optimistically renamed this holiday the Day of National Unity and Reconciliation. So Putin has pushed this holiday forward a few days to coincide with the Russian victory over the Poles in 1612. But like Russia Day, this holiday has not yet gained much traction with the public. And so even though it commemorates an occasion where the people rallied to end the so-called time of troubles, which kind of fits with Putin's favorite idea about like the 90s, also a time of troubles, I haven't really thought of anything much to do with this day. It's just kind of a surrogate for always having a day off in November. And once again, every year, the press is full of articles. Now they don't go out and ask in the streets because I think the official press prefers to sit home, not go out to the streets that much. But they write these articles titled, "What do we celebrate?" And then they explain like who are Menin and Bajarsky. But I think that question that they ask, what do we celebrate, and also why do we celebrate, are really good questions for people to ask when they want to think about what values matter to them. So to stop marking past repressions, to commemorate military victories, but not democratic ones, to celebrate symbols of statehood, but not really think about the events and decisions that triggered new Russian statehood, I think it sets the stage really for statist narratives in which the people are once again a mass and not citizens. So Yeltsin and his reform-minded colleagues may have neglected myth-making as an activity. In fact, I got the impression that they rather thought that, you know, having parades and making big holidays, like that's what totalitarian rulers do. So obviously we shouldn't do that. We'll just, you know, sort of have this laissez-faire thing people can do, you know, like, but in doing that, they didn't really foster any liberal democratic founding stories. And I think we feel that today. And Putin, on the other hand, definitely understands that narratives matter. And that's why, as I mentioned, he's constantly drawing this line between the wild 90s, wild in a bad sense, and the stable aughts. And it's also why he put so much effort into this call of World War II. Now, a couple of years ago, Putin unveiled a state-sponsored monument to the victims of oppression in Moscow. This had been the goal of the Memorial Society since 1985. And at the time, I worried that this commemoration was going to mean that going forward, the state wouldn't pay any attention to this history. They had checked the box. Victims commemorated, we're done, we're out, right? And it was an odd day as well, because Putin in his speech, while saying that these events of the past were tragic, he managed to make the entire speech in the passive tense. There was no causality to the terror, and there were no consequences to the terror. Memory was good, but no credit was given to civil society organizations that had made, reviving memory their cause. But my fears turned out to be wrong. It turns out it's not that the state wants to erase this history. It's just that they don't want to let independent voices talk about this issue anymore. So the current move to liquidate Memorial, I think, shows that the vigilant defenders of the state are not done with history. They want to go farther. They think historical narratives are too valuable, too dangerous to be left to independent thinkers and random gatherings of intellectuals. So no laissez-faire for the Putin regime. And here I'd say that when it comes to memory politics, the time of monopolies and censorship has really returned. All civic initiatives are automatic suspect again. So as we mark 1991 as the end of the Soviet Union, I think we should think about how 2021 seems to be signaling the end of something else from that period. And that is the end of perestroika and glasnost, because the hard-won freedoms of speech and association have really been stamped out in contemporary Russia. And that sense of possibility that Dean Hellman mentioned as a memorable feature of the Gorbachev years and of the early 90s, I think has really been submerged. And the mood today is much more one of pessimism, if not despair. So when I think about what we've really lost in these 30 years, I think what we've lost is hope. So stop there.
Thank you for the honor of the invitation. It's lovely to be here at Georgetown. Being the seventh person at the podium doesn't bode well for being able to say very much. And all the 10-minute presentations that have been longer have left us without a great deal of time. So I'm going to do two things and two things only. First, I'm going to reiterate very briefly arguments I made in the past, and then I'm going to evaluate those arguments. So in the 1990s, I began to give public lectures, try to explain the collapse. And I had a 5-part explanation, and I published this in 2000. And my 5-part explanation was that the outside world had changed. That it was not the Depression, it was not fascist militarism, it was not imperialism that capitalism represented anymore, but the image and especially the reality of capitalism had changed. And so the Soviet project now had to come up not against unemployment or Nazi tanks, but against nylon stockings, children's toys, and freedom. And it was crushed. It was absolutely crushed by the changes in the outside world. But so what? It lost. Doesn't have to capitulate. No one has to capitulate just because they lost. But the second point was that communist ideology destroyed the Soviet system. Because communist ideology was the biggest vulnerability and the biggest threat to the system. Everyone thought communist ideology was dead. Ha ha ha, nobody believes this nonsense anymore. But in fact, socialism with a human face, reform communism, was a widely, actually pervasively held belief system, and it had twice almost destroyed the system, once in Hungary in 56, a second time in Prague in 68, and now it came to power under Gorbachev in the 1980s in the Soviet Union, and it began unintentionally to destroy the Soviet system, because that's what communist ideology does. Reform, communism, socialism, in the face. You can't be half communist like you can't be half pregnant. Once you democratize the party, people don't want the party anymore. They begin to say the communist monopoly is no good, and they begin to argue for alternative parties. So there's no reform equilibrium, there's only auto liquidation. My third point, however, was that, and I saw this in real time, was that the conservatives would understand this, and they would know that reform communism, socialism with a human face, was dangerous, and they would crack down and overturn it. And so in 1990, I went to Yegor Ligachev personally to try to size up where the crackdown was going to come from and what it was going to look like. And I met him at his dacha. He was the #2 person and rumored to be a conservative, who was in favor of some type of reform, but not this auto liquidation. But I discovered that he was incompetent, didn't understand what was happening, and incapable of pulling off a crack. So there was no reactionary force sufficient enough to overturn Gorbachev's reform, and that wasn't an accident because he had put these people. So number 4, the Soviet structure. The Soviet structure was a fake federation, except it was real. How was it real? Well, the Communist Party was a pyramid, and the Soviet Union was a state federation. So the party overrode the federal structure, provided the party was still there. But once you dismantle the party, you change the federation from a fake state federation to a real one. And that's what Gorbachev accomplished. So the destruction of the Communist Party was also the destruction of the Soviet Union. And my 5th point was that opportunism then ran amok because people began to see that the place had been destabilized. There was no crackdown to end or reform communism. And so therefore, let's steal, let's take what we can. And so they found refuge in the republics. And so the Union republics became the refuge for the state officials. So you could stay in power just because now you were no longer a Soviet elite person, but you were a Ukrainian or a Kazakhstani or a Russian elite. And in the meantime, you could steal the property. This factory I hereby assign to myself, sign myself. And so the Soviet Union was privatized by the opportunistic elites before Anatoly Chubais or anybody else issued any decrees. So this 5-part explanation for the collapse of the Soviet Union, the outside world had changed and the Soviet Union had lost the battle. So what? The communist ideology was very dangerous and was allowed to go really far because number 3, there were no conservatives. And then the union structure was fake, except it was real once you removed the party. And then the opportunistic elites to save themselves, which they did very successfully, finished off the job. So it was not nationalism, but it was communism that destroyed communism. Okay, so I made this argument, as I said, in the 90s in public lectures, and then I wrote this book in 2000. What do I think about that book now? Well, I think the argument for the collapse of the Soviet Union has stood the test of time well. It's been very interesting to watch my argument being mischaracterized and contentiously dismissed. I've seen this beautifully done by Garth Nash. I've seen it beautifully done by Mark Kramer. It's been a whole industry to mischaracterize contentiously my argumentation. It's been fun to watch because that's how academia stays amusing. But actually, I was wrong. I was wrong about bigger things than the nature of the collapse. I've rethought it, and I now have to confess. So what collapsed was the Soviet state, but the Cold War didn't actually end. And I'm not speaking only about Asia, where communism didn't collapse and the Cold War didn't end. And in fact, World War II isn't even over in East Asia. I'm speaking about Europe. What we saw was a diminution in Russian power. It was not a long-term diminution, and it was not even that deep a diminution ultimately, because Russian power, as Catherine pointed out, not only in her book, but in her presentation today, is resurrected. as it was after it collapsed the last time during World War I. And so we got that big stuff wrong. In fact, it wasn't 1989 that was the big epoch, it was 1979. In 1979, we had the Iranian Revolution, Islamism coming to power. We're still living with this. This is a global phenomenon, and it's massive. We also had China and Deng Xiaoping, and that so-called reform movement, and is turning away from the Soviet model to de facto partnership with America. And we had the Reagan-Thatcher market revolution across the Anglo-American sphere. We had three colossal trends in '79, Islamism, Chinese reform under Deng and Reagan-Thatcher market revolution, that in many ways are still with us compared to the diminution of Russian power in 1989. Yes, we had German unification. Yes, this was a big deal in some ways, but Germany is still punching below its weight. Can we compare German power today following unification to any of these three other phenomena from '79? I think the answer is no. Germany punches under. We also had South Africa, and the fall of apartheid was highly consequential. It was related to these events. But if you put '89 together, a diminution in Russian power that didn't last, German unification that didn't live up to any geopolitical promise, you don't get anything on the scales compared to political Islam, the rise of China, or Reagan-Thatcher. I was wrong about '89-91. It was not as consequential as we thought at the time. I think '79 was much bigger, although I still stand by my explanation for how it's good. Thank you. I actually did keep it.
Yes, you do. Wow. It's hard to know. Well, we have certainly achieved multidisciplinarity. I think we would need another 2 hours perhaps to achieve interdisciplinarity. And because we have, and I include myself, fulfilled and over-fulfilled our plans, we are very short on time. So this is what I'm going to propose. We take some questions from the audience. And if you want, we still have almost all our audience out in the Zoomosphere. Please write a question in the chat, in the Q&A. You have, we'll go to the questions, then I'll give each panelist who wants to speak in response to any others or any questions to speak. So the floor is open for questions. Eric Lord.
I think I'll do something that my son does to me all the time and annoys me very much. But it's actually very good. And he always says, who cares? Because we're all going to die of global warming, we're all going to be flooded in the future. And it just raised a question for me that one of the fundamental kind of problems in Russian history that recurs over and over, if we talk about cycles of revolution, is getting really good at something when it's too late. Like the serf economy was at its peak and it allowed Russia to conquer all of Europe in 1814. But it was too late. The world was moving in a different direction. And then in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, Russia got really good at producing big stuff that helped them win wars, like tanks. But it was too late, as Steve said. You know, the outside world was moving on to pantyhose. And then in 1979, I thought you were going to say computer chips. But, you know, so I mean, I guess just thinking in terms of the longue durée and what the questions are and how we interpret 1991, I'm raising a question that wasn't on the agenda then, but is now.
Okay, other question?
There's a Russian phrase I heard in the 90s, which means we expected so much more, but we got what we always get. Did the Russians accept what they've got now, or are they still expecting more?
But another question. Just identify yourself.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask the panel in general what you make of the relatively recent rise in interest, especially among the younger generation, leftism, explicitly Marxism, among the generation that was born after 1989, if that has something to do with this global cataclysm, or if you see that as totally different.
question from the chat, maybe one more from the audience. No, okay. Let's see. I would like to start with the audience.
Okay, I can just take one of those, which is the Russians accept what they have, or do they want more? I think it depends on who you ask. There's a generational difference and a geographical difference and a wealth difference in terms of the answer you'll get. So, one thing I think that's quite telling is young people between 18 and 24 are asked every November, whether they're basically happy or not. Actually, it's not just them, it's everyone, and also whether they would consider emigrating permanently. In the last 2 years, those numbers have been going up. I don't want to misstate it, but it's in my book. It's over, when you add 18 and 24 and then 24 to 35, it's somewhere over 50% of people in those age groups. So I don't know if you asked in other countries what the numbers would be, and that would be important to know, but that strikes me as high and not healthy. So now there is a variation in terms of the number decreases as you go up in age. So I think that's a problem, to be honest, right? So what do younger Russians want, or in Russians who are kind of in their prime working career, they want to be part of a global economy. They, in big cities like Moscow and Petersburg or New York, they want to be plugged in and networked and, often with big businesses. And so who they blame for the situation is the question. But the fact that so many seem to want to leave permanently, either to Europe or the United States, is, I think, interesting and problematic.
Ellie, Olga, or Elliot, anyone care to take a crack at anything? No? I will speak just about some of the commonalities that I saw. I mean, there were a lot of differences, but the role of the state in various ways, right? Even Eliot's citizens of the Soviet Union were thinking about a state that no longer exists. And so it seems to me we are approaching these questions from a continuum of scale that ranged from Olga's personal memories to commemorations to entire, things that are happening in society and the state, to Steve Kotkin's global perspective, and that relates to Eric Lohr's question. So, the global is shifting at a level that's different from the state and from the more micro levels. How do we put them all together? That seems to me, that's why we have interdisciplinarity. But that's just a stab at trying to find some commonalities here. I wanted to just answer the question about revolution. Right? Was it 91 a revolution? Right? And I said there no storming of the Lubyanka, not because of the violence, right, but because of the institution, the failure to change the institution of the KGB. And so it seemed to me that a lot of, but I do think it's actually a complicated question. There are elements of revolution in it. What Kelly was talking about, crowds on the streets, strikes in response to the putsch, mass gatherings that we remember, this feeling of, hope. These were revolutionary, but in terms of the results, right? And Jack Goldstone, a historical sociologist, talks about revolutions as a kind of common denominator definition as mass mobilization for large numbers of people to change institutions in the name of social justice. And I think if we look at all four of those elements, we see some, but not others. So I'll stop there.
There are revolutions on the right.
There
There
are
are not just revolutions on the left.
absolutely, and so
And so I gotta be careful with Goldstone's definition.
well, he includes the Nazi Revolution in his short course, but which came to power through constitutional means, absolutely. So there are, but did the institutions fundamentally change from Soviet Union? New institutions were created, but weak ones. right? And Olga referred to the late Soviet practices, right, that are now back. So it's a complicated question. Any of our other panelists, Kelly or Olga? Or,
I'll just jump in on the question that Bradley asked about sort of interest in leftism. And I think here there is a constant, not just for Russia, but a constant global balancing of individualism and individual goals and a desire for some kind of cause or meaningful organization or collectivity. And I think in Russia, right, that's still associated with communist times. That was the time of the collective of, especially for young people, stories that they hear about, awful as some of these small projects were, that's when you did things that weren't just you did them through. But it's a balancing act, because I think the other thing that young people really want right now is the freedom to express themselves on the internet. And that's another kind of potential tipping point for the popularity.
anyone else? All right, we have any time for one more question from the audience?
Christine Morbeck. One thing that strikes me is that in the Soviet period, we also have a very strong dissident movement that predates Glasnost Perestroika. We also have a more vibrant religious landscape and market that predates Perestroika and Glasnost, and those have resonances, and some of it has changed in ways that we wouldn't have been able to predict, particularly the resurgence of a hierarchical church over a grassroots bottom-up church, and the compromises that have been made between church and state. But I think there was a lot going on prior to 1991 that's sort of missing in some of these discussions. Thank you.
Can I throw just one last question for your? I'd be curious, given the interdisciplinarity, multidisciplinarity of the panel, looking at this from 1991, we were talking about the sense of hope or lack thereof of what might happen in the countries themselves, what the trajectory might be, and talk about whether you are right or wrong. For those who were there at the time, also, I actually think we were also thinking about how this, what seemed like a cataclysmic set of events, might contribute to a changing understanding of our discipline as a whole. Like, oh, this is going to mean a rethinking of politics and international affairs. It's going to be a new approach to history or sociology or anthropology. 30 years later, do you see anything that's come out of your understanding of the experience that might have said, well, this is not about what happened in the functioning of the Soviet Union, but actually changed the way I feel thinking about it. Interesting, in economics, I think you can. Not sure. I'm curious about what you're.
Thank you for that. Well, history, the archival revolution, just access to sources, was a genuine change, but it was less to do with the events of 91 and indirect consequences of it. So I can't say that I see that 91 itself led to, that kind of change. History is moving. I mean, Stephen Kotkin wrote this in his article, "The State as It Was." It's our paradigms that have shifted with the discipline, not necessarily because we're, finding it in the archive.
I would say actually that there's been sort of radical change in terms of Russia and comparative politics, that in terms of the techniques and skills, it's partly reflective of the discipline as a whole, but the fact that now so many people have really great quantitative skills. They've also been able to use experimental methods because new data became available as well. And also being able to, some of the work that we did in the field in the 1990s, it, made us much more mainstream, a little bit more like Latin Americanists maybe, or some of that work we can't do at the moment, partly because of COVID, but also because Russia more mainstream in comparative politics, more comparable to other countries developmentally, and not, special case because of the communists. So I think actually it's broadened the scope of what we do, and then we kind of were able to compare this case.
Anyone on the screen? No? Yes, Elliot.
Well, if I'm here representing cultural studies, my answer is very quick, very simple. My discipline didn't exist, and couldn't without. When it comes to Russia, it couldn't exist without the stuff that happened leading to 1991 and after. So no point of comparison, but still very, very crucial for me.
So one point I want to add as well, of course, we have amazing scholars like Olga and other amazing scholars from the region who have these amazing skills that we did not have before in the social.
That's true of history as well.
Yes, that's the biggest change. The biggest change is that we're no longer monopolizing or speaking to no one. German studies was kept honest because there was a huge community of German scholars on the other side who read the archival materials or did the field work, the interviews, and so you couldn't just say anything. We didn't have that for the most part, with few exceptions, prior to 89-91. Not only do we have it today, but more and better and more interesting things are produced in languages of the former Soviet Union, including Russian, than in the English language today, in my estimation. Let me just have a point about revolution. So there are revolutions about liberty, not about social justice. And revolutions about social justice is a tale of tears and tragedy, of perverse and unintended consequences. There is a vast empirical history of revolutions in the name of social justice that have produced the opposite of social justice, whether with mass mobilizations or without. Whereas revolutions in the name of liberty have a less checkered history, complicated but a less checkered history. And there's something about liberty as opposed to social justice in a revolutionary framework that bears understanding and applies to 89-91 and applies to Eastern Europe as well as the Soviet Union and the cleavage there.
I would love to pursue this question, but I'm reminded of what the Bolsheviks said when they disbanded the Constituent Assembly, that the guard is tired. I want to thank everyone for and I want